Welcome to this deep dive, and we're going to be tackling a thinker who might even make seasoned philosophers raise an eyebrow, Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite. Imagine, try to explain to Plato that, centuries after his academy, someone would come along and mix his ideas with Christianity and just become, this cornerstone of Christian thought.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling, isn't it?
It's a real plot twist.
Yeah, but I think that's the beauty of Pseudo-Dionysius is that he takes these complex philosophical ideas, right, steeped in Neoplatonism. And for those unfamiliar with that term, that's a later school of thought that took Plato's ideas and gave them a more mystical direction. And he kind of weaves them into this intricate tapestry of Christian theology.
Yeah, and to make it even more interesting, our source, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Pseudo-Dionysius, this guy was like a master of disguise. We're talking 5th or 6th century CE, but he wrote under the name of a 1st century Athenian convert of St. Paul. So talk about a successful pen name.
Really makes you wonder what his motivations were, right? Was it a way to give his ideas more weight in a time when Christianity was becoming the dominant force? Or was it something deeper, a reflection of his own understanding of the hidden nature of God?
It's like a philosophical detective story.
Yeah.
And speaking of mysteries, we have to talk about his works. Pseudo-Dionysius left behind 4 treatises on the divine names, on the celestial hierarchy, on the ecclesiastical hierarchy, and on mystical theology. And get this, there are even lost treatises that we only know about through references, so we're left to speculate what other ideas he might have explored.
It's a shame we don't have those lost works, but even with the ones we do have, getting through them is not exactly a walk in the park.
Right.
His language is dense, full of biblical allusions and complex philosophical terminology. It's like he's speaking in code sometimes.
Yeah, definitely not beach reading material.
Right.
So for those brave souls who want to tackle Pseudo-Dionysius, what are some of the big ideas they should be prepared for?
Well, one of the most important and perhaps initially confusing concepts is apophatic theology. And essentially, it's the idea that we can't truly grasp God through language or positive descriptions.
So instead of saying God is this or God is that, we should focus on what God is not.
Mm-hmm.
So it almost sounds like we're talking about God by talking around him.
Precisely. And for a philosopher listening to this might sound familiar. Think of Socrates and his constant questioning, his insistence on recognizing the limits of human knowledge. Apophatic theology takes this idea a step further, suggesting that even our most sophisticated concepts fall short when trying to define the divine.
So if we can't box God in with words, how do we even begin to understand him?
Well, that's where Pseudo-Dionysius gets really interesting. He introduces the idea of hierarchy, seeing the universe as this beautifully ordered structure with everything emanating from God and reflecting his glory in different ways.
Wait, hold on. Hierarchy. Didn't philosophers like Plato already talk about that?
They did, and that's what makes Pseudo-Dionysius so fascinating. He takes this philosophical concept of a hierarchical cosmos and infuses it with Christian meaning. So you have these different levels of being angels, humans, even the church itself, all organized into ranks, each playing a specific role in the grand scheme of things.
So it's like a cosmic ladder with each rung representing a different degree of closeness to God.
That's one way to think about it, but for Pseudo-Dionysius, hierarchy isn't just about ranking beings in terms of their importance or proximity to God. It's also about the way in which God's grace and love flow down through creation and how creation in turn aspires to return to its source.
So it's not a static system, but rather this dynamic interplay between divine love, procession, and return. Okay, I'm starting to see how he's weaving together these philosophical and theological threads.
And there's more. We haven't even touched on his ideas about divine love and the role of symbols in spiritual understanding, but we can delve deeper into those in the next part of our deep dive.
That's right. We'll be right back after a short.
What are you doing? We're not doing breaks anymore, remember?
Oh, right. Sorry, force of habit. Well, we'll jump right into those fascinating topics in part 2 of our deep dive into the world of Pseudo-Dionysius. Don't go anywhere.
So we've established that Pseudo-Dionysius was drawing heavily from Neoplatonic thought, particularly those ideas of emanation and hierarchy.
Right.
But he wasn't just copying his philosophical predecessors. He was transforming them, reshaping those ideas within a Christian framework.
Right. And one of the areas where this transformation is most evident is in his understanding of divine love. Neoplatonists talk about this kind of cold, impersonal emanation from the one, the ultimate source.
Right.
But Pseudo-Dionysius injects something kind of radical into the equation, love.
Exactly. He argues that God's creative power flows out into creation, not out of necessity, but out of love.
Hmm.
Imagine like a fountain overflowing with water.
Okay.
That's like God's love constantly pouring out into creation.
I like that.
But then that water eventually flows back to its source.
Right.
That's the idea of return. We're drawn back to God by that same love. It's this beautiful dynamic interplay.
Okay, that analogy really helps. So it's not this deterministic top-down process,
Right.
but rather this reciprocal flow of love connecting God and creation.
Right.
But how does this idea of divine love play out within the hierarchical structure he talks about?
Right.
It seems like those two concepts might clash a bit.
It's a good question, and it's one that philosophers have been grappling with for centuries, but Pseudo-Dionysius offers a nuanced perspective. He argues that while there's a clear hierarchy of beings with each level reflecting God in different ways, God's love is ultimately present to each individual being directly.
So it's not about climbing the hierarchical ladder to reach God,
Yeah.
but rather recognizing that he's already there within us and all of creation, regardless of our position in the grand scheme of things.
Precisely, and this brings us to another key aspect of his thought, the role of symbols in our understanding of the divine.
Okay.
Remember we talked about apophatic theology and how it emphasizes the limits of language? Well, Pseudo-Dionysius recognizes that for most of us, pure contemplation of God is incredibly difficult. We're easily distracted, caught up in the world of senses.
We're only human after all. So how do we bridge that gap between our finite understanding and the infinite mystery of God?
That's where symbols come in. Think of them as a kind of ladder, helping us ascend from the realm of the senses to the realm of the intelligible, ultimately leading us toward a deeper experience of the divine. And for Pseudo-Dionysius, the most important symbols are those found in Scripture.
So that's why he spends so much time interpreting biblical imagery. It's not just about taking those stories literally, but rather uncovering the deeper spiritual truths they point to.
Exactly. He's showing us how to read between the lines, how to see those symbols as signposts pointing us towards the divine. For example, there's this image of God being drunk on wine in Scripture.
Okay.
It might seem strange or even disrespectful at first glance, but for Pseudo-Dionysius, it's a powerful symbol of God's overflowing love.
It's like he's saying that God's love is so abundant, so intoxicating that it defies our normal ways of understanding. But let's be honest, even with these symbols, trying to wrap our heads around Pseudo-Dionysius' ideas is a challenge.
Yeah.
His writing is notoriously dense and difficult.
There's no denying that part of it is the language itself. He's constantly weaving together biblical references with complex philosophical concepts, creating this intricate tapestry of meaning that demands careful attention. It's like trying to solve a philosophical puzzle.
I bet even Plato would needed a study guide for some of this stuff. But I'm sensing there's more to it than just the complexity of the language.
Yeah.
What else makes his writing so challenging?
Well, remember how we talked about apophatic theology, that approach to understanding God through negation by saying what he is not?
Right.
Well, that leads Pseudo-Dionysius to use a lot of abstract and paradoxical language, which can be difficult to grasp.
Like he's constantly pushing the boundaries of language, trying to express the inexpressible. It's almost as if he's saying, don't just read my words, experience them. Let them take you on a journey.
That's a great way to put it. His writing isn't just meant to be passively consumed, it's meant to be engaged with actively, like a spiritual exercise. He's using language as a tool to guide us on a journey of spiritual ascent toward a deeper understanding of the divine.
So it's not just philosophy. It's almost like a form of mystical poetry, using words to point us beyond words.
And speaking of mystical experiences, that's a perfect segue into the final aspect of Pseudo-Dionysius' thought, that we need to explore the heart of his mystical theology.
Let's dive into that. But before we do, I have a question for you and for our listeners out there who are philosophy enthusiasts. Do you think Plato would have been impressed by Pseudo-Dionysius' work? Or would he have just shaken his head and said, this guy's gone off the deep end?
That's a fascinating question, I think. I think Plato might have been both intrigued and challenged by Pseudo-Dionysius. On the one hand, he's using the philosophical tools that Plato himself developed ideas about, forms, even the structure of the cosmos. But he's taking those tools and applying them to this new, evolving understanding of the divine through Christianity.
Yeah, it's like he's taking the blueprint of Plato's philosophy and building a whole new cathedral on top of it. A cathedral dedicated to the Christian God. But a cathedral with some pretty mysterious and maybe even hidden rooms.
Right.
Speaking of which, we've been dancing around this idea of mystical experience throughout our deep dive. What exactly did Pseudo-Dionysius have to say about that?
Well, remember how we talked about apophatic theology and the limits of language when it comes to describing God?
Yeah.
That's really where his mystical theology comes into focus in his short but incredibly powerful treatise. Mystical theology, Pseudo-Dionysius, lays out a path for ascending to this direct experience of the divine.
Okay, I'm intrigued, but let's be honest. The idea of mystical experience can sometimes sound a bit, well, mystical. What does it actually mean to have a direct experience of God?
That's a great question, and it's one that is probably puzzled philosophers and theologians for centuries. But for Pseudo Dionysius, it's not about having some kind of emotional high or seeing visions. It's about transcending the limits of our rational minds, stripping away those layers of conceptual understanding until we reach a state of pure unknowing.
Unknowing, that sounds a bit paradoxical. How can we know anything about God if we're striving for unknowing?
It is a paradox, but it's a paradox that lies at the heart of mystical experience. It's
Uh,
about recognizing that our limited human concepts, even those derived from philosophy, can only take us so far to truly encounter God. We have to let go of those concepts to embrace the mystery, to enter into what he calls divine darkness.
Divine darkness. I have to admit, that's not the image that usually comes to mind when I think about God.
I know it sounds a bit counterintuitive, right? But think of it this way. We're so used to relying on our senses, on our intellect, on those things that we can grasp and define. But Pseudo-Dionysius is suggesting that to truly encounter the divine, we have to go beyond all of that, to enter into a realm where those familiar ways of knowing no longer apply. It's about a radical openness, a surrender to something that transcends our understanding.
I'm starting to see how this connects back to the idea of apophatic theology. It's like he's saying we can't define God,
Mhm.
so let's stop trying. Let's embrace the mystery, the silence, the darkness, and see where it leads us.
Exactly. And he uses this powerful analogy of Moses ascending Mount Sinai. Remember, Moses journeys through the darkness, leaving behind the familiar, until he reaches the summit and encounters God for Pseudo Dionysius. This ascent represents our own spiritual journey. We have to move beyond the realm of the senses, even beyond the realm of intellectual understanding, to enter into a state of pure communion with the divine.
It sounds almost like a form of philosophical meditation, a practice of stripping away those layers of thought and perception to reach a deeper truth.
There's definitely a parallel there, and it's important to note that for Pseudo-Dionysius, this mystical experience isn't something that's reserved for a select few, like monks or mystics. Remember how we talked about that direct connection between God and each individual being, and that connection is always there waiting to be realized.
So, in a sense, we all have the potential to become mystics, to experience this profound union with the divine, and to connect it back to our initial question. Maybe even Plato, with his emphasis on transcending the world of appearances, might have found something to appreciate in Pseudo-Dionysius' mystical theology.
I think so. After all, both of them were ultimately seeking a deeper understanding of truth, of reality, of that which lies beyond the limits of our ordinary perception. And they both recognize that sometimes the path to that understanding requires letting go of what we think we know and embracing the unknown.
Well, I don't know about you, but I'm feeling inspired to do a little philosophical soul-searching after this deep dive.
Me too. It's amazing how a thinker from so long ago can still speak to us today, challenge our assumptions, and invite us to explore those deeper dimensions of our own existence.
So to our listeners out there, whether you're a seasoned philosopher or just starting to explore these big questions, we encourage you to keep diving deep into the world of Pseudo-Dionysius, the Areopagite. You might be surprised by what you discover.